Texas, 1944. The sun burned white across the open plains, and the air shimmered over endless rows of wire fencing. Inside, behind the barbed coils, hundreds of German prisoners stood restless beneath the weight of heat and defeat. Their uniforms were faded, their boots coated in dust from a land that felt like another planet. Beyond the fence, the smell of mesquite smoke drifted on the wind, slow, rich, unmistakable. It was barbecue. The man tending the fire wasn't a soldier. He was a rancher, broad-shouldered, hat tilted against the glare, moving with the steady patience of someone who'd known this land all his life. He stirred the coals, lifted the lid, and let the smoke roll toward the camp. German eyes followed him with suspicion, hunger, and quiet confusion. No orders were given, no speeches made, just a man and his pit, cooking in silence. But in that silence, something changed. The prisoners leaned closer to the fence. Guards looked on, uncertain. It was the smallest act of all, sharing food, sharing scent, sharing curiosity. Yet by sundown, that smoky invitation would begin to melt a wall far stronger than wire or fear. When the United States entered the Second World War in December 1941, few could have imagined that within 2 years, German soldiers captured thousands of miles away would be standing behind fences in the heart of Texas. The North African campaign had turned the tide. By May 1943, the Allies had captured more than 250,000 Axis troops, men of the Afrika Korps, Luftwaffe ground crews, and Wehrmacht infantry units who had fought under the blazing desert sun. Shipping them back to war-torn Britain proved dangerous and costly. America, distant and secure, became the ideal place to keep them. By late 1943, a quiet migration began across the Atlantic. Freighters and troop ships that once carried American boys toward Europe now returned with German POWs owners. The U.S. War Department scrambled to prepare. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war were to be treated humanely, provided food, shelter, and medical care equal to that of the detaining army's own soldiers. But implementing those ideals across a country unprepared for such numbers was no small task. The War Department and the Office of the Provost Marshal General began constructing a vast network of prisoner of war camps scattered across the American heartland. Over 500 main and branch camps stretched from Maine to California. Yet one region offered the perfect mix of open space, cheap land, and warm climate. Texas. With more than 70 camps built across its vast territory, the Lone Star State became the unlikely center of a quiet wartime phenomenon. In small rural towns, barbed wire rose on the edges of fields once meant for cattle. Farmers watched trucks roll by carrying men in gray uniforms marked PW on the back. Local families peered from porches as columns of guarded prisoners marched along dusty roads. For many Texans, the sight was surreal. Men they had seen only in newsreels or battle reports now living down the road. The initial mood in America toward the prisoners was tense, uncertain, even hostile. The war in Europe still raged. Many Americans had sons fighting overseas, some never to return. The idea of enemy soldiers being housed, fed, and even working among civilians struck some as almost unthinkable. Yet the reality of wartime logistics soon reshaped those feelings. By 1943, a severe labor shortage gripped rural America. With millions of young men drafted into military service, farms, lumber mills, and factories struggled to stay afloat. The War Manpower Commission, desperate for solutions, saw an opportunity. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to perform non-military labor if they volunteered. And so, a plan emerged. POWs could help fill the gap in America's labor force, under strict supervision. In Texas, that plan found both fertile soil and reluctant hearts. The land was vast, the work endless. Cotton picking, fruit harvesting, lumber cutting, fence building. Local farmers were skeptical at first. Could they really trust captured Germans to work their fields? But as the war dragged on, practicality began to outweigh pride. Across the state, agreements were made, contracts signed, and buses began carrying groups of prisoners to ranches and farms at dawn. At first, the workdays were stiff, wordless, heavy with suspicion. The Germans obeyed orders but kept to themselves, proud and distant. Many were career soldiers, loyal to discipline even in defeat. Some had been indoctrinated under Nazi propaganda, viewing cooperation as dishonor. Yet others, young, weary, far from home, saw in the wide Texas fields a strange freedom. The air was hot but open. The guards were firm but fair. The food, though simple, was plentiful. Slowly, the bitterness of captivity began to loosen its grip. Still, there was tension. Escapes were rare, but not unheard of. Occasional fights broke out among prisoners themselves. Die-hard Nazi loyalists against those who simply wanted to survive. American officers had to balance security with humanity, discipline with decency. Most camps OPEI rated under a philosophy that would later prove decisive. Treat men like men, and they will act like men. That philosophy found its truest expression not in Washington orders, but in the quiet fields of Texas, where ordinary citizens, farmers, guards, and labor supervisors met their former enemies face to face. It was in those encounters that the most unexpected lessons of the war began to take root. Because somewhere among those endless rows of cotton, there was one rancher, a man raised on dust and fire, who believed more in hard work and fair play than in politics. To him, a man's worth wasn't measured by the flag he fought under, but by how he carried himself when beaten. And in the dry heat of a Texas summer, that belief would spark something remarkable. One small act, simple, human, and utterly Texan, would begin to change how hundreds of prisoners viewed their captors, their labor, and even their enemy. It started not with speeches or punishment, but with smoke rising from a pit of burning mesquite. Texas in 1944 was still a land of distance, miles of sun-baked earth stretching between towns where everyone knew one another by name. The war had changed that. Roads once empty now echoed with military trucks, trains carrying supplies to the Gulf Coast, and convoys heading toward Army airfields cut from prairie grass. Amid this movement, the arrival of prisoners of war became one of the most curious sights of all. German soldiers, once feared symbols of Europe's conquest, were now an everyday part of Texas life. The camps were scattered like quiet islands across the state. Hearne, Mexia, Hereford, Huntsville, and scores of smaller satellite camps housed thousands of men under the watch of the U.S. Army. From the outside, they looked like military compounds. Rows of wooden barracks, watchtowers at each corner, double layers of barbed wire fencing. Inside, life was surprisingly ordered. Prisoners had daily routines, roll calls, and work assignments. They received American rations, medical care, even cigarettes when available. Many were shocked by the relative comfort. For soldiers who had expected starvation or cruelty, the discipline of the American system felt almost merciful. Still, captivity carried its own weight. Letters from home were slow to arrive, and rumors of the war's progress crept through like wind through the wire. Some men learned their hometowns had been bombed. Others didn't know if their families were still alive. The prisoners organized themselves into small groups, sometimes holding evening discussions, sometimes building makeshift gardens or crafting wooden souvenirs from scrap material. Officers tried to maintain dignity. Ordinary soldiers, bored and uncertain, searched for purpose. That purpose arrived through work. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could volunteer for non-military labor, paid modestly, provided it didn't directly aid the enemy war effort. Texas farmers were among the first to take advantage of the program. The war had drained local labor. Sons were overseas, and migrant workers were scarce. Cotton fields needed hands. Lumber mills needed sawyers. Peanut farms needed harvesters. The answer came from behind the fences. Every morning, guarded trucks and buses carried groups of prisoners into the countryside. They wore plain khaki uniforms marked with PW and worked under American supervision. At first, the atmosphere was cold and mechanical. Prisoners performed their tasks with precision but little heart. Many Texans treated them cautiously, unsure how to speak or even look at them. The barrier between us and them ran deeper than barbed wire. But Texas had a way of softening people. The days were long, the work backbreaking, and there was something in the shared labor. The rhythm of picking cotton, the hum of tractors, the scrape of shovels, that began to erase old lines. Some farmers discovered the Germans were polite, disciplined, and skilled. They built fences straight, worked hard, and asked few questions. Prisoners, in turn, were astonished by the fairness of their treatment. They were paid in camp scrip they could spend at the canteen, received letters through the Red Cross, and occasionally shared leftover fruit or cold water from the farms they worked. At night, they returned to camp dusty, tired, but no longer bitter. Rumors spread among them, stories of American farmers who treated them not as enemies, but as men. A few even smiled when guards cracked jokes or asked about their lives before the war. One report from Camp Hearn noted that prisoners there sang while they worked. German folk songs drifting over Texas soil, yet the transformation wasn't universal. Not all guards were kind, and not all prisoners were ready to let go of pride. The Nazis among them condemned any cooperation as betrayal. Some still carried portraits of Hitler hidden in their belongings. But the longer they stayed, the harder it became to sustain hatred. The land itself seemed to demand honesty. It was too vast, too unyielding to waste energy on anger. Among the many Texans who oversaw these work programs were ordinary men, local ranchers and foremen recruited by the War Department to manage the labor crews. They were not soldiers by training, but they knew how to handle men. They spoke plainly, expected hard work, and respected those who gave it. And in this strange wartime meeting of worlds, one of them, a cowboy from Central Texas, would find a way to connect that no manual or regulation could ever teach. His method wasn't born of strategy or policy. It came from instinct, from understanding what made men work, what made them listen, what made them human. One afternoon, when the air hung heavy with the smell of dry grass and dust, he did something that no officer, no guard, and no government order had tried before. He fired up a pit, tossed in mesquite wood, and began to cook. The smoke rose over the fence line, curling in the wind like a signal. It wasn't a bribe. It wasn't pity. It was something simpler, a gesture of normal life, a reminder that even in war, men could still share a meal. The prisoners watched. The guards waited. And as the coals glowed, a silent bridge began to form. One that would soon carry hundreds of men from resentment to cooperation, from defiance to quiet respect. To understand what happened next, it helps to see it from every side. The American commanders, the local Texans, and the German prisoners themselves. Each carried their own expectations, their own burdens, and none of them could have imagined that a simple barbecue fire might shift the balance between suspicion and trust. For the American military administrators, the Texas camps were experiments in discipline and diplomacy. The War Department's guidelines were clear: maintain order, prevent escape, and uphold the Geneva Convention. But inside those principles was a quieter challenge: how to manage the minds of thousands of men who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler. Officers soon learned that punishment rarely worked. It hardened the prisoners' pride. Lectures on democracy were met with polite silence. The solution had to come from somewhere more human than regulation. Local camp commanders often left daily operations to civilians who could handle men through respect, not rank. The Texans chosen for this task were often ranchers or foremen, men used to leading tough crews in brutal heat. They knew when to be stern and when to be fair. They understood something that military bureaucracy often missed. Men, even defeated ones, responded to dignity more than to orders. Among these civilians, attitudes varied. Some carried resentment, having lost friends or brothers in the war. Others saw the Germans as no more than hired help. Yet there was also a quiet curiosity. Many Texans had never met a European before, let alone one from the enemy's side. What they found surprised them. The prisoners were often educated, well-mannered, even grateful. They fixed machinery, repaired roofs, and built irrigation channels with skill. Soon enough, the camps began to rely on their labor, not just out of necessity, but because the men did their work well. Meanwhile, for the Germans behind the wire, captivity was both humiliation and relief. After years of fighting, the silence of the Texas countryside felt almost unreal. There were no bombs, no hunger, no fear of death at dawn. But there was emptiness, a loss of purpose. Many of them had been told they would be treated brutally if captured. Instead, they found themselves given meals of beans, bread, and coffee, and expected to work in exchange for small wages. For men trained to see the world through propaganda, the reality of fair treatment created quiet confusion. And yet, pride remained. Among the prisoners were officers, engineers, and students. Some had joined the Wehrmacht out of duty, others through coercion. They carried within them the ideals, myths, and arrogance of a defeated empire. To them, surrender was shame. Labor was humiliation. Their discipline held, but their morale wavered. The hardest battles were not fought against guards, but within their own hearts, between resentment and the slow realization that survival required humility. For the Texans, the presence of the POWs was a daily paradox. On one hand, they represented everything the war was meant to destroy: Nazism, militarism, cruelty. On the other, they were men who laughed, sweated, and cursed the heat like anyone else. Some locals feared escapes, but the wide-open plains made running pointless. The nearest friendly border was over 1,000 miles away. Others feared fraternization, but human nature ignored fences. A few farmers began offering the prisoners water, and later, sandwiches or fruit during long workdays. Regulations frowned on it, but people followed their instincts more than rules. It was in this uneasy balance that the Cowboy's trick found its ground. The man at the center of it wasn't a military officer or a politician. He was a foreman on a large ranch contracted to use POW labor during the harvest. Years of working with stubborn cattle and rough ranch hands had taught him that men worked best when they felt part of something, even a small thing. He noticed the Germans worked mechanically but without pride. They followed orders precisely, but their movements carried no life. One evening, after a long day in the fields, he decided to stay behind and cook. It was nothing special, a habit more than a plan. He built his fire, laid out the meat, and let the smoke roll. The Germans stood by the trucks, curious but unsure whether they were allowed to approach. The guards waited, unsure whether to interfere. The rancher said nothing. He just cooked, quietly, the way Texans had for generations, slow and steady. Then, without announcement, he motioned toward the food. The guards hesitated. The prisoners hesitated longer. But hunger overcame suspicion. A few stepped forward, accepted a plate, and sat down in silence. There was no speech, no grand gesture, just men eating under the same sky, the same heat, the same smell of mesquite and salt. It was a simple act, almost invisible in the scale of war, yet it carried weight. For the first time, the Germans saw something that training and propaganda had denied them: the humanity of their captors. The Texans saw something too. Not soldiers of a fallen Reich, but men stripped of arrogance, grateful for food and a moment of normalcy. That evening, the distance between them shrank not through force, but through smoke and silence. What began as an accident of kindness soon became an example, one that others would quietly follow. In the days that followed, The story of that barbecue spread quietly through the camp. No official report recorded it. No headline ever mentioned it. Yet among the prisoners, it became a kind of legend. The men spoke about the cowboy, who had treated them like guests, not captives. They talked about the flavor of the food, the easy silence, and the strange feeling that, for one brief evening, the war had stepped aside. It was a small thing, but in the world of prisoners and guards, small things carried power. The cowboy never saw it as anything more than decency. He came from a culture where sharing food was second nature, where hard work was rewarded not by speeches, but by a good meal and a handshake. He didn't do it for praise or policy. He simply believed that a man would give more of himself when he was treated with respect. The next day, he noticed the difference. The same men who had once moved with cold mechanical precision now worked with quiet energy. They didn't talk much, but their effort changed. The cotton came in faster. The fences went up straighter. They took care with tools and equipment. Something invisible had shifted. It wasn't magic. It was psychology, though no one called it that back then. The act of breaking bread together, even across lines of war, touched something deeper than orders ever could. The prisoners began to see the cowboy as a symbol of fairness, even friendship. They still wore the letters PW on their backs, still slept behind barbed wire, but their attitude toward their work changed. Voluntary labor, once seen as a form of humiliation, became a routine that gave structure to their days. The guards noticed fewer complaints, fewer arguments, and a calm that no amount of discipline had managed to enforce. The American officers overseeing the program were cautious but observant. Reports from Texas camps noted unusually high productivity and morale compared to other regions. Prisoners there volunteered for farm duty at rates almost double those in the Midwest or East Coast camps. Inspectors attributed it to the humane and practical approach of local civilians. They didn't mention barbecue, but they might as well have. For the Germans, it was more than just work. The experience challenged years of indoctrination. They had been told Americans were weak, corrupt, materialistic, enemies without honor. Yet here, in the dust and heat, they met men who valued honesty and effort, not ideology. The Texan foreman didn't lecture or argue politics. He didn't need to. His actions spoke in a language older than any flag. Respect given, respect earned. At night, around their barracks, the prisoners began to talk differently. They compared Texas to home. The open land reminded them of Bavaria or the plains of Brandenburg. Some began sketching, carving, or even writing letters about their days. A few confessed they felt more useful here than they had in months of war. One young soldier reportedly told his bunkmate, "It's strange to feel free inside a fence." The guards too changed in subtle ways. Many had arrived expecting hostility, convinced the Germans were arrogant or dangerous. Instead, they found men willing to work, to learn, even to laugh. Some of the guards, especially those from rural backgrounds, began to treat the prisoners like farmhands rather than captives. They kept watch, of course, but their tone softened. In the evenings, a few would chat about weather, crops, or baseball. Regulations forbade fraternization, but friendship has a way of bending rules when both sides need a little humanity. The local townsfolk took longer to accept it. For months, they'd avoided the sight of the camps. Some parents warned children not to go near the fences. But over time, curiosity replaced fear. Farmers who'd hired POW crews told their neighbors about the hard work and the good behavior. Soon, word spread that the Germans were not monsters but men. Some towns even allowed supervised prisoners to help rebuild barns or repair public roads. By the summer of 1944, it was common to see them working alongside Americans. Silent, sunburned, indistinguishable from any other laborer from a distance. Through it all, the cowboy's quiet gesture became part of the camp's rhythm. Every few weeks, when a long harvest ended, he'd light his fire again. The prisoners would gather near the fence, smiling now, waiting for the scent of mesquite. It was never an official event, never written down, but those small gatherings carried an unspoken message. Respect wasn't given through rank or orders. It was earned through simple decency. What no one realized at the time was how deeply it would affect those men after the war. Years later, when many of them returned to Germany, they would speak of Texas as the place where they had learned that their enemies had hearts. Some even wrote letters back to the ranchers who had treated them kindly. A few returned decades later, not as prisoners, but as guests. And at the heart of all those stories stood one man's choice to cook. An ordinary act that cut through ideology, fear, and defeat. It showed that sometimes the greatest power in war lies not in weapons or commands, but in understanding that even enemies share the same hunger for dignity. By mid-1944, the transformation within the Texas camps was no longer a quiet rumor. It was visible in every field, every work truck, every line of men returning at dusk. What began as an experiment in necessity had become a demonstration of human psychology under war's shadow. The prisoners were still behind fences, still technically enemies of the United States, but something fundamental had changed. They no longer worked because they were told to. They worked because they chose to. The turning point came in the heat of late summer, when tempers and temperatures ran equally high. The harvest season pressed hard, and long days in the fields left men irritable and exhausted. One morning at a camp near Mexia, a small dispute broke out between a guard and a group of German workers. It started over a broken hoe, nothing more, but voices rose, and the line of prisoners stopped moving. A handful refused to continue until the issue was resolved. The guard, uncertain, called for his supervisor, the same cowboy who had once lit that pit of mesquite smoke. He arrived slowly, riding up in a truck coated with dust, calm but firm. The guards expected him to order punishment. The prisoners expected the same. Instead, he looked over the broken tool, shrugged, and handed over another from the truck bed. "If the tool's bad," he said simply, "fix it or get another. Works hard enough without fighting over what's already broken." Then he turned and walked back toward the fence line. The tension dissolved almost instantly. The prisoners went back to work. The moment passed, but its echo lingered. That small act of fairness, quiet, almost casual, did more to restore discipline than any show of force. Word spread quickly among the Germans. The cowboy respected their effort, not their surrender. The guards noticed it too. Men obeyed more willingly, worked faster, and watched out for each other. The foreman didn't lecture them about democracy, but his actions reflected its spirit: accountability, equality, and plain honesty. It was then that the barbecue trick evolved from a single event into a kind of tradition. After long weeks of labor, when the trucks rolled back into camp covered in red dust and tired laughter, the cowboy would light his pit again. This time, he invited not just the guards, but the prisoners as well, still under watch, but free to share food in the open yard. The officers allowed it, knowing the results spoke louder than regulations. The first shared meal drew nearly the whole work detail. The prisoners stood uncertain until one of the guards offered a nod. Plates passed hand to hand, the air thick with the smell of smoke and grease. Someone brought out an old radio, its signal faint but steady, broadcasting a swing tune from Waco. For a few hours, the war seemed to vanish beyond the horizon. There were no enemies, no victors, just men, sunburned and weary, chewing quietly under a fading Texas sky. What followed in the weeks ahead was nothing short of remarkable. The number of prisoners volunteering for field work rose sharply. Fewer disciplinary reports were filed. Escapes dropped to nearly zero. One internal War Department memo from 1945 noted that morale among German prisoners in Texas remains unusually high due to consistent fair treatment by civilian supervisors. The officers who read it likely never knew that the roots of that morale came not from military discipline, but from the smoke of a cowboy's fire. For the prisoners, these moments reshaped everything they had been taught about America. Many had entered captivity expecting cruelty. Instead, they found order without oppression. Some wrote in their diaries that they felt respected as men, though conquered as soldiers. The experience created a quiet revolution inside the wire. Authority no longer came from fear, but from trust. Even among the hardliners, those still loyal to Nazi ideology, cracks began to show. They tried to discourage cooperation, whispering that the Americans only pretended to be kind. But the proof was too strong. Each meal shared, each fair decision, each gesture of respect chipped away at their certainty. The propaganda of hatred had no answer for barbecue smoke and honest work. And beyond the camp, the effects rippled outward. Local farmers noticed how the prisoners worked willingly, how the guards seemed relaxed, how the fields filled faster. The story spread quietly from one community to another. Some doubted it, others tried it, and before long, across central Texas, the same pattern emerged. Food, fairness, and work became the foundation of order. That summer marked the peak of transformation. It was no longer about one cowboy or one camp. It was about an entire network of people learning, almost by accident, that empathy could succeed where force failed. And though no medals were awarded for it, that lesson, born of heat, hunger, and smoke, would endure far longer than the war itself. As the summer of 1944 deepened, the transformation in Texas POW camps began to catch quiet attention from those higher up the chain of command. Inspectors visiting from Washington expected to find tension and hostility. Instead, they saw order, productivity, and something rare, a sense of calm. In their reports, they used words like cooperative spirit and model efficiency, never realizing they were witnessing the outcome of a small human revolution built around fairness and food. At Camp Hearn, officers noted that volunteers for outside work details exceeded requests. At Camp Mexia, local farmers began writing letters of thanks to the Army, praising the work ethic of the Germans. Even newspapers, under wartime censorship, began printing vague stories about prisoner labor aiding Texas agriculture. But the real story remained unspoken. It was about men who had discovered a strange kind of peace in the middle of a world at war. The cowboy himself, his name rarely mentioned in any record, carried on without ceremony. To him, it was all common sense. I didn't think of himself as changing hearts or bridging cultures. He just believed that when a man eats beside you, he's less likely to see you as his enemy. Each weekend, when the work week ended, he'd open the pit again. He'd wave a few guards over to help, and soon the smell of hickory and mesquite would drift toward the barracks. The prisoners would gather at the wire, waiting. It was no longer curiosity that drew them, but a kind of trust. Over time, the wire itself seemed to lose its menace. Guards began letting a few trusted men help set up tables and carry water. The atmosphere was almost impossible to explain, halfway between military discipline and Sunday neighborliness. There were still rules, still rifles, still the unspoken awareness of war beyond the horizon. But something else had taken hold. Mutual respect, born not of orders, but of quiet repetition. One evening, a sudden thunderstorm rolled across the plains, breaking the heat. The cowboy refused to cancel the gathering. He dragged the pit under a makeshift awning, rain pouring down, steam hissing from the coals. The prisoners, instead of retreating to the barracks, stayed to help. They held the canvas in place, laughing when the wind caught it, mud splashing across their boots. The guards stood by, bewildered at the sight. Men from opposite sides of the world working shoulder to shoulder to keep a fire alive. That night, soaked and grinning, they ate together again. Wet uniforms, dripping hats, and all. It was the moment when everyone realized the line between us and them had quietly blurred. There were no speeches to mark it, no photographs to prove it, but every man who stood under that canvas understood what it meant. War might divide nations, but it could not destroy decency. After that night, the change became permanent. When new prisoners arrived, men hardened from Europe's front lines. The old ones told them, "You can work here, it's fair." Within weeks, they too volunteered. The cycle continued, feeding itself. The cowboy's method had become an unspoken code, a way of leadership based on earned trust. He gave no orders beyond what was necessary, and in return, the men gave him loyalty. Meanwhile, news from Europe grew darker. The Allies were advancing. Cities like Hamburg and Dresden were being bombed to ruins. Prisoners received letters that smelled faintly of smoke and sorrow. They learned their families were displaced, their homes destroyed. In those moments, the Texas fields became more than a workplace. They became a refuge from a Europe that no longer existed. Many of the prisoners began carving gifts for their supervisors. Small wooden boxes, model cattle, even hand-carved signs burned with Danke, or "to our friend." Such tokens were technically discouraged, but quietly tolerated. One officer later recalled finding a small wooden cross left at the gate after a group's final workday. On it were etched the words, "For the man who cooked." By late 1945, as the war in Europe ended, the camps began preparing for repatriation. Trains would soon carry the men back to ships bound for a devastated homeland. As they packed, their few belongings, carved trinkets, photographs, folded letters, they carried something intangible with them, the memory of a place that had shown them mercy without weakness. On their final day, the cowboy came to see them off. He shook hands with each man who stepped aboard the truck. Some saluted him. Others simply nodded. When the last one climbed in, he turned back once and raised his hand in farewell. The cowboy lifted his hat in reply. The engine rumbled to life, and the convoy rolled away, disappearing into the horizon. No one took pictures. No one wrote the names. History would move on to larger battles and louder victories. But in that quiet departure, something rare had been achieved. Enemies had left as men changed, not by force, but by a simple act of shared humanity. And as the dust settled behind the trucks, the cowboy stood for a long while, hat in hand, watching the empty road fade into the distance, the last trace of smoke still rising from his fire. When the last German prisoner left Texas, the camp stood eerily quiet. Rows of empty barracks, silent mess halls, and abandoned watchtowers cutting against the wide, unbroken sky. What had once been a strange collision of enemies now felt like a ghost town. The wind carried, the faint smell of earth and burnt wood, as if the memory of barbecue smoke still lingered in the soil. Local farmers noticed the absence immediately. For nearly 3 years, the POWs had been an unseen backbone of wartime agriculture. Cotton had been harvested, pecans gathered, and fields irrigated by hands that once held rifles. Reports sent to Washington recorded the numbers cleanly. More than 425,000 Axis prisoners had been held across America, with over 50,000 in Texas alone. But the documents could never capture the quiet bonds that had grown in those fenced-in worlds. When the war ended, many of the guards and farmers who had worked with the prisoners described a strange sense of loss. Not for the war, but for the human connections forged under it. In one archived letter, a Texas farmer wrote, "We learned more about Germany through those men than any book could tell us." The Army's records show that violence within Texas camps was remarkably low compared to those in other states. Escapes were rare, sabotage nearly non-existent. Analysts attributed it to efficient camp management and discipline, but those who had been there knew it was something more. The unwritten rule of fairness, and the strange, almost neighborly approach of men like the cowboy, had changed how prisoners behaved. Work became less about compulsion and more about participation. They weren't forced to help, They volunteered because they were treated as human beings. After their return to Germany, many former POWs wrote letters to their American counterparts. Some were addressed to camp officers, others to farmers, and a few to men like the nameless Cowboy whose kindness had turned suspicion into respect. One letter preserved in the National Archives reads, "In Texas, we found peace while the rest of the world was burning. We learned that an enemy can also be a teacher." Those words would later appear in local Texas papers during the early 1950s, part of a growing fascination with how America's treatment of prisoners had softened future relations between nations once divided by blood. Historians would come to call it the Texas model, a pragmatic yet deeply humane system that balanced security with dignity. It stood in contrast to harsher wartime internments elsewhere in the world. By allowing prisoners to work, to earn wages, and to interact respectfully with civilians, the U.S. not only upheld the Geneva Convention, but also turned captivity into rehabilitation. For the Germans, it became a place where defeat was met not with humiliation, but with quiet decency. The Cowboy's simple act, firing up a pit and sharing smoke with his so-called enemies, became part of that broader spirit. His name, lost in official files, lived on in stories told by those who witnessed it. To some, he symbolized the best of America's wartime conscience, the belief that mercy could be stronger than command. To others, he represented a universal truth about leadership, that men follow those who understand them, not those who rule them. As Texas returned to peacetime rhythms, the camps were dismantled. Some barracks became barns or storage sheds. Others were torn down entirely. But in the towns that had hosted them, echoes remained. Former guards spoke at veterans' halls about the strange fellowship that had grown between captors and captives. Farmers told their sons about the hard-working Germans, who helped them save their crops. And every so often, someone would mention the Cowboy who cooked, whose fire seemed to warm even those behind barbed wire. By 1947, the war felt like a memory already being polished into legend. Yet the stories from those Texas camps refused to fade, quietly carried in letters, photographs, and a few fading carvings left behind by men who came as enemies and left as human beings again. Years later, when the world had rebuilt itself from the ruins of war, the legacy of those Texas camps lived quietly in both countries. In post-war Germany, many of the men who had once stood behind barbed wire in Texas found themselves rebuilding bombed cities and broken industries. Among them were farmers, engineers, and craftsmen who had learned new methods, new ethics, and even new ways of seeing work during their captivity. In interviews decades later, several former prisoners spoke of how their time in America changed their understanding of responsibility. "We were treated as men, not as enemies," one recalled in a 1982 oral history project. "That taught us to rebuild with respect instead of bitterness." Across Texas, reminders of that strange chapter endured in quiet corners. Some ranches still held old wooden benches built by POWs. A few barns were made from the lumber of dismantled barracks. And in small county museums, yellowing photographs showed groups of German men smiling beside Texans, uniforms replaced by work shirts, rifles traded for shovels and hammers. What had begun as a wartime necessity had turned into a lesson in humanity, carved into the memory of both sides. The Cowboy himself faded into legend. His name never appeared in official military correspondence or government archives. But in local memory, his story survived through word of mouth. Old ranch hands would say, he could make a fire so good it made the war stop for a minute. Hers told of how he once refused to let a guard strike a prisoner who'd stumbled during work, simply saying, "He's tired, same as us." Whether every detail was true or not didn't matter. What mattered was that he had become a symbol of how one person's decency could ripple through an entire system built for control. Military historians who later studied America's POW policy concluded that the humane treatment in camps like those in Texas had lasting effects far beyond the fences. When the Federal Republic of Germany rose from the ashes in 1949, many of its leaders and soldiers carried with them memories of how they had been treated in captivity. Some even cited it as an influence in shaping West Germany's democratic and cooperative post-war culture. The cycle of vengeance that had defined 2 world wars began to weaken, replaced by cautious understanding. And at the heart of that transformation were countless small, forgotten acts of kindness. A guard sharing coffee, a farmer paying wages fairly, a cowboy lighting his fire at sundown. In the decades that followed, reunions were held. Not of victors and vanquished, but of men who had once shared those Texas summers. Former prisoners visited the old campsites, now open fields or cattle lots. They brought their families, walking the ground with quiet reverence. Some met the families of guards or farmers who had worked beside them. There were handshakes, photographs, even tears. One German man, visiting in the late 1970s, placed a small, wooden carving on the site of the old Camp Hearn fence line. It read simply, "To friendship, born in strange times." By the turn of the century, most of those who had lived through it were gone. The camps had returned to dust, their stories stored in archives and memories. But the lesson endured, that power alone never wins loyalty, and that even in war, respect can build bridges that guns cannot. The smoke from the cowboy's pit had long since vanished into the Texas wind. Yet the spirit of that gesture, feeding men who had once sought to destroy your world, remained one of the quietest, strongest testaments to the human heart in wartime. It proved that victory could be measured not only in battles won, but in bitterness undone. The fences rusted away, the fields grew over, and somewhere in the wind, if you listened long enough, you could almost hear the crackle of old wood burning, a sound that once turned enemies into neighbors beneath the vast, forgiving Texas sky. History often remembers the loudest moments, the battles, the treaties, the grand speeches that reshape nations. But sometimes, the truest change begins in silence, far from the front lines. In Texas during the Second World War, one man with a fire pit and a sense of decency managed to accomplish what guns and politics rarely could. He made strangers see each other as human again. The cowboy's story was never about heroism in the traditional sense. He didn't wear medals or lead armies. He simply acted on instinct, that a man's dignity doesn't vanish when his flag falls. In the heart of war, he found something stubbornly peaceful, the belief that kindness was not weakness, but strength in its purest form. And because of that, a camp built to contain enemies became a place where cooperation thrived. When those German prisoners returned home, they carried more than memories of heat and dust. They carried an understanding of fairness and discipline rooted in respect, not fear. Some went on to rebuild their own towns, shaping post-war Germany with values they had glimpsed in captivity. In that way, a single cowboy's gesture stretched across oceans and decades, whispering that humanity can survive even in the hardest soil. Today, the barbed wire is gone. The guard towers have collapsed. But the story endures, not in textbooks or monuments, but in the quiet knowledge that even the smallest act of grace can echo far beyond its moment. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by those who fight, but also by those who choose not to hate. Beneath the endless Texas sky, the smoke has long since faded, but its meaning remains. That decency, when shown without demand or expectation, has the power to disarm even the hardest heart. And perhaps that is the real victory of war, not in how much ground is gained, but in how much humanity is preserved. The cowboy never sought gratitude, never wrote his story. Yet in the silence of his fire, he left behind something indestructible, proof that compassion, once lit, can burn quietly through time, carrying the warmth of peace long after the war has ended.